don't think they should be banned. It's not the dog's fault that the people don't know how to bring a dog up.
The debate about other breeds doesn't hold water because all the attacks that have occurred in South Africa are associated with this particular breed, the pit bull. All the children that have died, all the victims that are within our communities are victims of a particular breed, the pit bull.
The story of a 15-month-old toddler mauled to death by pit bulls in the Eastern Cape made headlines this week. Today, we would like to get your views and thoughts on this via our Twitter handle @TheWeekInReview. And we'll take a look at some of your responses a little later in the show. But a very good afternoon. And if you've just joined us, we are coming to you live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Welcome to The Week in Review, of course, where we take a look at some of those big stories that came out of the week, perhaps also what made headlines and kept South Africans talking. I'm your host, Liesl Wilson. Let's get straight into it. Right, as the heat turns up for the ANC ahead of its national elective conference set for December, we take a look at what unfolded for the party this week. The African National Congress has announced the candidates for its top 6 positions ahead of the party's upcoming elective conference set to take place in December in Nasrec. The conference will determine who will be leading the ANC's National Executive Committee leading up to the country's general election in 2024. The nomination figures were announced by ANC Electoral Committee Chairperson Kgalema Motlanthe on Tuesday.
For President Cyril Ramaphosa, the total tally of nominations are 2,037. 2,037. And for Dr. Zwelini Mkhize, the total tally is 916.
Meanwhile, Tourism Minister Lindiwe Sisulu officially launched a dispute following the formal announcement of the ANC's top 6 nominations. ANC Electoral Committee Secretary Chief Libuwani Matsila said they were ready to deal with complaints and appeals.
If a comrade like Lindiwe Sisulu would cast aspersions on that kind of a process, it means she's blaming the provincial and regional secretaries, and that is not correct.
Sisulu complained that the file nominations do not correlate with data given during the announcement. She is demanding to know what exactly happened to the list of candidates or requests to see the raw data. On Thursday, Mzwandile Masina resigned as an ANC councillor in Ekurhuleni. He steered a bitter fight with the Gauteng leadership over a possible power-sharing agreement with the EFF, while defying the ANC by pushing for a motion of no confidence in the mayor of Ekurhuleni, Tanya Campbell. Lastly, in other news making headlines this week, news of the release of Janus Walus broke as Constitutional Court judgment was delivered on Monday. The reactions continue to pour in.
The decision of the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services made in March 2020 rejecting the applicant's application for parole is reviewed and set aside, and to take all such steps as may need to be taken to ensure that the applicant is released on parole within 10 calendar days from the date of this order.
The ruling party, the ANC and its alliance partners, the SACP and COSATU, are organizing a program of action across the country to protest the Constitutional Court's decision to grant parole to Chris Hani's killer, Janus Walus.
I don't know if you had, Zondo never referred to my family, to myself, to my children, and the trauma and the suffering. He couldn't give a shit.
We will have to go to the drawing board to see how to remobilize society on a matter of justice for the people, not justice for criminals. Because we believe that today, indeed, in the court of justice, an injustice has occurred.
The program of action is set to kick off on Saturday and includes a picket at the Constitutional Court in Johannesburg. Right, so on the back of this, the ANC, along with its alliance partners, the SACP and COSATU, are set to picket outside the Constitutional Court in Braamfontein, Johannesburg today. The main reason for the picket, which will also see the MK-MVA being part of, is to express anger and disappointment at the release of Janus Walus on parole. He was convicted by court for the murder of activist Chris Hani back in 1993. Perhaps for this and more, the latest at the picket, we cross to SABC News reporter Kani Mapanga. Kani, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Perhaps you could give us an update on what is transpiring on your end. What is the turnout? Is there a possibility that this decision could be appealed?
Well, good afternoon to you, Liesl, and the viewers at home. Of course, not quite the numbers that we've expected, but there are some people who have gathered to mobilize against the court-ordered release of Janus Walus from prison. That is Chris Honey's killer. But it does appear that there may be some updates that we need to give the viewers right now. So I'm going to be joined by the SACP's General Secretary, Solly Mapaila, to elaborate by himself on some of those updates that could affect this court-ordered release that could happen in the next coming days. Mr. Mapaila, thank you for joining us and giving us your time today. You have stated before that you are outraged by this unanimous judgment. And of course, the family has sought out the advice of their legal representatives. Can you elaborate as to what to expect from the SACP and the Honey family regarding this judgment legally?
Firstly, is that to be outraged is an understatement. We are extremely disappointed. Much because most of our consideration and our submission were not listened to in the judgment. At least the justices should have just responded to our submission, our own defense, and even dismissed them so that we know where we stand on a matter of law, but not to just disregard them. And I think that aspect was extremely disappointing. They've only referred to the Honey family and the SACP insofar as applicants, nothing on content. And of course, fundamentally, we also felt that wrong issues reached the Constitutional Court, and therefore we don't want to lose faith in the Constitutional Court. I think that's very important because we are here to express ourselves, to defend the Constitution as well, not to condemn the Constitution, to affirm the Constitution, which gives us this right of protest, but to express our disappointment with the ruling by the court, which is the apex court of the land. Because when that court makes judgments, it should not be found wanting. And that is why it must explore all avenues, satisfy itself before it makes judgment. Judgments, we know, they don't have to satisfy all parties. But at least everyone must have a sense of the sincerity of the law, the respect of the law, the authority of the law. But this was not expressed. We could see disdainful attitude towards us as communists, because this is Walus and his co-conspirator Clive W. Lewis had indicated that they took this action because Chris Hani was a communist. Our rights are not affirmed, are not protected by the judgment, which is extremely worrying. So we'll take it up, and our existence as communists will not rely on judges. It's our right to exist as individuals, our ideology and so forth. So with regard to the matters going forward, we have decided in consultation with the family, we spent the whole day yesterday having a discussion with our legal representatives and so forth. We wrote a letter yesterday to Minister Ronald Lamola, indicating to him already that we are taking action. And on Monday, we'll be finalizing our discussion with the legal representatives as per the meeting we had yesterday, to look into what framework they found in law to oppose his release. Firstly, we have agreed with them that we should be able to put a rescission order into the process. It's a legal process, so that if you are not satisfied with the judgment of the Constitutional Court, you can apply for that and look into what legal matters you can raise for them to consider that they may have ignored. And we hope that despite that it was a unanimous decision, they would have the magnanimity to look into the issues that they ignored, particularly our submission, which was not referred to in the judgment. Secondly, is that we're exploring other avenues, including taking up this matter to the African Court of Commission on Human and People's Rights, to look into that based on their approach. And therefore, we'll then be able to explore on that basis the stay of execution of the order, which we'll have to also consider in the next couple of days. That's why we have indicated to Minister Lamola in our letter that we're exploring these avenues within this framework that we've been given by the court.
Just to clarify, has the minister in any capacity indicated that this court-ordered release would be delayed by your application that you intend to make at the Constitutional Court?
Well, he has not replied to us. We sent him the letter yesterday in the afternoon after our meeting with the Hani family and the legal team. So we'll possibly get a response Monday morning or Monday, and we'll take it from there. But the bottom line is that we have already alerted him that we have decided to take up that route to explore further our rights.
And to further clarify, you'll be returning to the Constitutional Court on what date to pursue this application?
We'll be receiving the documents on Monday from our legal team. And if we agree with what they've looked into regarding the process of the law, then they will indicate when to submit. Possibly, obviously, should be within the 10 calendar days as indicated by the Chief Justice. So we'll comply with that process as we exercise our rights in this regard to use the law to affirm our constitutional right, because some people are indicating a wrongful attitude that we are here to condemn the court. We are not here to condemn the court. We are differing with the judgment. But we accept that this is the apex court. We are here to express ourselves within the rights of the Constitution that we also fought for. We don't want to affirm apartheid laws at the expense of democratic laws. So that's what we are here for, and we will exercise those rights.
And is it correct that the SACP feels aggrieved, as well as the Hani family, that the one element you're aggrieved about is that you don't believe that he has fully disclosed how this led to Chris Hani's murder in April of 1993?
We've always said we are not evils. And I think some people have created this impression that we are unforgiving. The man has never told the truth. That's the reason why he could not get indemnity from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If together with his co-conspirator Clive W. Lewis have told the truth, they may not have stayed this long in jail, but they refused to tell the whole truth or the truth. Secondly, he was not remorseful. Because they can't tell the truth, you can feel there's no remorse, and therefore they remained unrepentant. As a result, on what basis should you then engage in victim-offender dialogue if you can't tell the truth, or you are not apologetic, or if you apologize, you only state so, not to the family, but to the system, so that you tick the box that you are complying, when actually you have not. If you want to apologize to the family, say what I did, it's wrong. This is the reason why I did it. Who sent me? We ask you questions. You respond to those questions. Where did you get the weapon? We were told that the weapon from original investigators would have come from the armory of the then South African Defence Force. Who gave it to him from the armory? Who collaborated with him? All of those things. He would have been able to tell the family, and the family would have looked into that sincerely and say, well, we forgive you or we don't forgive you. But at least he would have told the truth. So we have opposed his parole largely on this framework. And today he's been released without ever telling the truth. A whole right-wing fascist assassin. And on that basis, victims of apartheid government, of apartheid regime, liberation heroes are still in jail today when their issues are not fast-tracked for them to be released, who are fighting for the democracy that we enjoy against this apartheid regime. But those who stood on the side of the apartheid regime have been released. We have had, for instance, de Kock, the prime evil, who was characterized as prime evil, who killed many of our comrades and anti-apartheid activists and liberation fighters. He was able to come out and in some instances told the truth, named some of the people who gave him orders and why they did these things and so forth. And as a result, some of the families accepted his explanation, forgave him, and were able to have a sense of acceptance and to move forward. And on that basis, others refused. They still could not forgive him. But at least he came forward, he began to tell the truth. He led the missing task team to go and identify where they killed most of our people, all of that. So on that basis, his case, despite that we differ with him because of the number of people that he killed, he was able to be released. This one, unrepentant, he can't tell the truth.
All right, thank you so much. That was the General Secretary of the SACP, Mr. Salim Mapaila, just outlining the legal action that is going to take place. I just want to quickly step out of frame, Liesl, before I toss it back to you, to show you the numbers that they have regarding this protest or picket at the Constitutional Court against the release of the killer of Chris Hani, Mr. Janus Walus. You've heard from Mr. Mapaila himself that this battle is not going to stop here. They are seeking legal advice and do plan to bring that rescission application to the Constitutional Court. Over to you in studio.
Thank you very much for the update. Again, from our reporter, Kanima Panga, just giving us the latest developments where we've heard the ANC, along with its alliance partners, the SACP and COSATUS, are picketing outside the Constitutional Court in Braamfontein. That's where we're going to leave it for you today. There's more news and updates on the other side upon our return. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We continue with more news now. 16 days of activism for no violence against women and children campaign has called for women to be empowered economically. This is to ensure that they are the less vulnerable, where the campaign was launched in Nasrec, Johannesburg, just yesterday.
Ushering in the annual 16 Days campaign, with female-owned businesses forming the backbone of this year's initiative, hundreds of women-owned enterprises from across South Africa showcased their products and services. They believe the more women are empowered economically, the less vulnerable they will be to social challenges such as gender-based violence and femicide.
We believe that if women are financially independent and economically independent, they will have a voice. Depending on the perpetrators, it's what makes us to be continuously abused, to be continuously being victims of abuse. So if we are able to fend for ourselves, then we will be able to stand up for ourselves.
These business women also took advantage of the opportunities at the expo, especially to network. The country was reminded that women form the majority of the country's population at more than 50%, but only 20% are active in the business sector. Government believes this smaller representation of women in business has marginalized women and deepened gender economic inequality, which has a direct impact on women's vulnerability to violence.
Besides that, women in this country fought for freedom. They should gain access into the economic well-being of this country.
A call was made for men to embrace economically empowered and independent women. Men are also urged to speak up about the pressures they face and not to take their frustrations out on women and children.
The men must not bottle up. We see a lot of men hanging themselves, committing suicide. Let's talk to the men. We know that we've got a number of systems that can help people. Let's go to our pastors. Let's go to our social workers.
One, we are here to say we are sorry. We admit, Uti, we stuffed it, we messed it up. Number two, we are here to say what now is the way forward. Because gender-based violence cannot only necessarily talk about violence against women. There is a lot of material and research showing that you also as women have also violated men, and most of the people are quiet about it.
The campaign will focus on various programs to create awareness on the scourge of gender-based violence and femicide. It will end on the 10th of December. Patricia Fasachi, SABC News in Johannesburg.
All right, for more on this, we're joined by Kubi Rama, Executive Director, Gender Links, and Lisa Vetz, and researcher specializing in gender-based violence at the University of Johannesburg. A very good afternoon to the both of you. Kubi, let me perhaps start with you. Between July and September of 2021, 897 women were murdered in South Africa. And for the same period this year, that number has now increased to 989. So it's an increase of 10.3%. The numbers continue to rise at an alarming rate. Hi, Kubi, can you hear me? I just wanted to get your take on the increase in these statistics year in, year out.
Yeah, good afternoon, Liesl and Lisa. You know, I think fundamentally, even that excerpt that you played is where it all starts. All of that rhetoric that we heard about our women, you know, this whole gender-based violence is part of a bigger problem of gender inequality. Whose women are we? Who do we belong to? I mean, you know, it's just from there you see where women are located, and that's where the power dynamics start. These statistics are alarming. It was alarming when it was 800 and something. It's alarming when it's 900 and something. The question I truly have is, why do we always come back to this question on during the 16 days? Yes. Obviously, it's a problem for the whole year. Secondly, what are we doing wrong, people? We are doing the same things over and over again. Yes, economic power is absolutely critical and important so women can find their way out of abusive relationships or take control of their relationships. But at the same time, what are we not getting? Why are we not, you know, why is it not going down? And for me, fundamentally, one of the biggest issues is that what are we doing around prevention? What is the prevention agenda? Where are we starting with that? All the research we've done is gender links, and we did baseline research on the prevalence of gender-based violence in 7 countries, including South Africa. And the majority of people who either experience or perpetrate violence either witnessed or experienced violence as children. Of course, there are other factors like addiction, like alcohol, etc., but primarily, and that is not to say every person who was abused as a child or experienced abuse is then an abuser, no. But that is the primary driver. And the reason for that is you see that behavior becomes normalized. It is the way people live. So if we want to start addressing gender-based violence and see those numbers go down, we're going to have to start very early on. And start
Kubi,
with children.
Let me bring Lisa into the conversation, perhaps before you
Sure.
continue with your points. Lisa, if you can, I believe you on joining us via telephone, just on the back of that 10.3% increase. Again, 16 days of activism is here to, you know, really shine a spotlight on the plight of women and children. But, you know, again, as Kubi alluded to, it cannot be limited to 16 days alone. What are we getting wrong? How is this contemporary reality also shaped by some of the more systemic issues that have perpetuated society to date?
I mean, I'd like to pick up a little bit on Kubi's point about the statistics. The single biggest problem with the statistics is that we use them to get outraged, to get upset, to express alarm and shock. We don't actually use them as information to tell us about where the problems in South Africa lie. We don't use them to look at trends over time. All we do is compare 3 months of this year with 3 months of last year. We don't look at it over a year, and we don't look at it over a 10-year period. Nor do we have a particularly good look at what's going on in provinces. And the problem of us not doing that means that we don't really understand what's going on to some extent in relation to violence against women in South Africa, which immediately impairs and limits our ability to do things that are localized and specific. So to give you some examples, if we look at the police statistics for women's murders, and this has also been substantiated by independent research, then women's murders have more than halved between the 1990s and last year, since we don't have full figures for this year yet. So we have seen a reduction, but nobody can say what has caused this reduction over time, what it is that has been effective, and therefore what it is we need to carry on doing and stop doing if we want to continue having an effect on reducing femicide. If we take an even closer look at femicide, we start to see that it looks very different in very different provinces. If you live in the Northern Cape, for instance, 2/3 of women there who are murdered by their intimate partners. But if you go to the Eastern Cape, less than half of women who are murdered there are murdered by their intimate partners. So we have two provinces next to each other showing very different patterns. We can't use the same strategy to intervene and to help there, but we are not doing the necessary research to go and say, here are further questions that we need to ask. So it means inevitably, as Kubi is saying, we will keep on doing the same thing, making the same messages year and year after year without trying to drill down deeper into what's going on and what are the differences between the countries. Because I think if we started to look more carefully at the differences, we'd get to a better understanding of why is it that in here violence is higher than here, and therefore what do we need to do?
So Kubi, just on the back of what Lisa's just echoed then, she's speaking about how there cannot be a blanket approach. And, you know, there's a deep call to analyze the data, to really understand the patterns and trends that have emerged so that we can find concrete results. But to date, what, you know, are some of the socioeconomic factors that, you know, have contributed to this mammoth problem, perhaps exacerbated by the pandemic? And at this point, perhaps as we isolate certain scenarios, what mechanisms can be used to introduce and combat this somewhat?
Very difficult question to answer because, as Lisa's saying, what are you combating? What's driving it? What is contributing to it? And one of the provinces, if I'm not mistaken, in Mpumalanga, showed a decrease. Now, let's try and understand that more. What happened in Mpumalanga that perhaps contributed to that decrease? But I think also, you know, none of these things happen in isolation. We're part of a system. And let's be clear, the system involves many different institutions. But one of the biggest issues we have is our our economic system. Our macroeconomics in South Africa are primarily about men, and still a lot of, you know, white men, African men, but the presence of women within those echelons is very low. The majority of women are in what we call the informal sector, which is probably, even during COVID, there was so much relief for the formal economic sector, but nothing for the informal sector. So just by naming it the informal sector, you're relegating it. It's not as important as the formal economy. I think we need to redefine our economics. And we also need to look at why women stay in abusive relationships. And our research and our programming, women stay in abusive relationships, and we are very critical of women staying in these relationships without really understanding why they do it, is because they want a roof over their children's heads. They want their children to be able to go to school, to be able to have something to eat. And the minute they start reclaiming their agency, their confidence, and being able to control resources, having access to some level of finances, then that starts to change. So while we're here talking about bringing these statistics down, if you go to a shelter, you therefore, you know, the amount of time is different. It could be 28 days, it could be 6 weeks, but what happens thereafter? What are we providing? We're not providing secondary housing. We're not providing access to economic opportunities. So many women will go back.
Yeah. So actually, Lisa, I want to bring you on the back into the conversation on the back of what Kubi's just echoed, because it seems that indicators of growth and oppression, you know, sees sexism, GBV, as multidisciplinary. It happens on different levels. Kubi calling for, you know, redefinition of economics. How do we begin to navigate the power structures that currently persist in society? How do we look at the role of men, patriarchy? How do we also counter some of the microaggressions and even the silences that tend to perpetuate the status quo?
I mean, those are very complicated questions, and I think that's why it's actually in some respects wrong to speak about gender-based violence as a crisis.
Okay.
Typically, if you use the word crisis, you're implying something that's short-term, that is sudden, rapid, developed immediately overnight, and is something you can quickly bring to an end. Now, it would be very nice if gender-based violence was a crisis in that sense. But the point is, if we look at it historically, it's been deeply entrenched through laws. It's been deeply entrenched through patterns of ownership of property, ownership of businesses, who's been skilled, who's been educated, an economy that has been built around assumptions that women are going to stay home and look after children while men will go out to work. So when you have created a social structure over hundreds of years that's built like that, it doesn't get dismantled overnight. And you can't call it a crisis because it has such deep roots. So I think trying to alter things like an economy, the way it's been structured and its dependence on women being paid less and doing particular kinds of work while men do other kinds of work is a very hard thing to dismantle in the space of 2 or 3 years. So then when we start to understand there's a more deeply entrenched problem, we can then start to think there are no quick fixes. And what are the different things we need to tackle to try to undo this? Because it's all very well in some respects, and it is important to have more women in business. But many women are not business owners. They don't want to be, and running a business and running an enterprise is very difficult. So we need to ask, why is it that companies are not employing them? Why is the work that they're doing valued less? Why do we still have things like gender pay gaps? And what is it that we need to tackle at that level? That's just the economic side. Then we can get into all the complexities of the economic disparity between different parts of the country. So I think, when you have service delivery protests about the lack of water, unsafe roads, etc., lack of toilets, etc., those too are contributing to violence against women, because if you're walking a long distance to go and collect water, you are potentially vulnerable to violence. If you're using public transport, walking through fields with long grass, with no lit, no security, you're vulnerable to violence. What is local government doing about that? So I think the challenge is really to think about in these multifaceted ways, so to get out of the language of crisis, which I think is what everybody thinks we're going to fix it quickly, and get so disappointed because we can't.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. I'm going to have to leave the conversation there. Kubi as well. I know that it seems that there are more questions than answers at this point, but thank you for echoing those sentiments and for being part of the conversation. Kubi Ram, Executive Director, Gender Links, and Lisa Vetten, researcher specializing in gender-based violence at the University of Johannesburg, weighing in on the 16 Days of Activism for No Violence Against Women and Children campaign that kicked off on the 25th of November. We'll leave that conversation there. It's time for a quick ad break, and there's more on the other side upon our return. Welcome back to the Weekend Review with myself, Liesl Wilson. In other news now, if you have any form of debt, brace yourself. Your loan repayments will be higher. This comes after the Reserve Bank raised the repo rate by 75 basis points to 7%. This will push the prime lending rate, the rate at which banks lend money to their customers, to 10.5%. Now, the central bank says this is in a bid to curb inflation that has been on an upward spiral, driven by high food, fuel, and energy prices.
Indebted consumers are in for a difficult time this festive season. Their disposable income will be further reduced as they will be paying more for their debt. Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago says risks to the inflation continue to be on the upside going forward. This is on the back of continued Russia-Ukraine war affecting prices globally, high oil and electricity prices. Inflation is expected to average 6.7% for this year, higher than the Reserve Bank's targeted 3 to 6%, before slowing to 5.4% next year.
The response of the MPC with this policy decision is to respond to the future pressures that could build up with inflation. And this is necessary because South Africans are complaining about the rising cost of living, and it is important that the central bank continues to deploy its instruments to tame the monster of inflation.
The 75 basis points increase means all forms of debt that consumers hold will go up. If you are repaying a car loan, or you have a credit card or a home loan, repayments will increase by 75 basis points. If you are repaying a home loan of R1 million over a 20-year period at prime lending rate, on average, your payments will go up by R499. Your bond installment would have increased by 2,080 Rand when you look back at what your repayment was in November last year when the Reserve Bank started hiking rates.
Having seen the interest rate now above pre-pandemic levels does suggest that debt servicing costs for indebted consumers has risen. And that means that there's more money that's being allocated to servicing debt and taken away from other spending on items in the economy. As a result, we do believe that the consumer is in a weakened position. And going into next year, we believe that a number of headwinds are mounting for the South African consumer, including a reasonably bleak employment outlook on the back of the growth forecasts that have been penciled in from the South African Reserve Bank.
The high interest rate environment will likely impact sectors in the economy like retail, as consumers will have limited funds to spend.
It has a negative impact on the retail sector. So, yeah, with increased debt servicing costs, obviously consumers have less disposable income to spend on more discretionary goods. So that sucks a lot of capital and spending out of the retail sector. And of course, with higher interest rates, your growth, GDP growth, gets affected with a sort of a 6 to 9 month lag. So that for many sectors in the economy, that's a headwind.
The Reserve Bank has downwardly revised expected economic growth for this year to 1.8%, down from 1.9% at the last MPC meeting. Economic growth is expected to slow to 1.1% next year. Gloria Sefako-Musi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Right, for more on this, we're joined by Chief Operating Officer, Debt Rescue South Africa, Annelien van der Poel. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Annelien, ultimately, what impact will the steep November repo rate hike of 75 basis points have on South Africans, especially those who, again, are paying off debt on their property, cars, and even credit cards?
It's going to be horrible. The reality is that we knew it was coming. We've been expecting it. We've been watching what the inflation has been doing the past couple of months, and it's inevitable that this was going to happen. But the reality is, for consumers, there's just nowhere left for them to cut. On the one side, they have the impact of the actual inflation on their normal expenses in their budget. So on the one side, they're seeing the cost of living rising on things like food and fuel and transport and all those factors. And on the other side of their budget, they've got their monthly debt repayments, and this just keeps going up because of the impact of the interest rate. So it's incredibly, incredibly difficult for the average consumer out there.
So speaking about the rough ride ahead, perhaps you could talk to the main drivers of inflation that contributed to the steep rate hike decision.
Well, there's been a couple of factors. Obviously, we know that transport's been one, the cost of food has been another. And these are things that obviously we feel in our pockets immediately every month. And the concern is for the past 6 months, for pretty much as this financial year has started, we've been on the outer bounds of what the Reserve Bank wants us to achieve, which is the 3 to 6%. We've been above that. We've seen in the last 3 months, it's been 7.6, 7.5, back to 7.6. We know this is international, similar kind of trends of seeing the inflation being this high. And even more worrying is we know that on the international front, they are preparing for the possibility of recessions next year. So we all know that what happens on the international market, inevitably we are going to feel on our side. And therefore, we know that they've marked down our growth potential for next year. That's going to affect employment. So it's definitely, 2023 is going to be a very tough year as well.
So then, Annelien, on the back of what you've just echoed, do you agree with Governor Lesetja Kganyago's approach to managing inflation, that the central bank will continue to rely on interest rates to bring down inflation in both the short to medium term?
Well, the Reserve Bank's core function at the end of the day is to make sure that our exchange rates and everything remains stable as well. And then through that, they have to monitor what inflation does. And whatever inflation does, they have to take the necessary actions. And those actions are inevitably, going to be interest rate hikes. We are hoping that by middle of next year, it'll start stabilizing and with a bit of luck actually start moving down after that. But it's very difficult to forecast right now, because we know as much as we have our local impact and factors that are affecting this right now, we know we've got a global impact. We have to look at what's happening in the rest of the world. We have to look at what's happening with the Ukraine conflict, with the US and UK's local impact on their economy, because inevitably we are going to feel the effect of that. And it's looking quite bleak right now.
Absolutely. And then just then in conclusion, what advice do you then have for people, many of whom have nowhere left to cut on their budget after, you have relentless cost-saving measures, cost-saving increases? What advice do you have for them?
Well, I think if you've now honestly had a look at your budget and you've gone through everything and you have made every change you possibly can, when you're in a position where you're still sitting with debt on the other side that you have to service as well, is to look towards something like debt counseling. This is a legal process to assist consumers who are over indebted, who are struggling to repay their debts, as well as manage their necessary living expenses as well, whereby they get legal protection, they can repay their debts in a more affordable manner, albeit over a slightly longer period of time. But at least they're honouring their debt obligations, they're preventing future legal action against them, maintaining their assets. So yeah, definitely make sure that you are looking at all the options out there and seek help before you end up in a difficult situation.
Annelien, thank you very much for joining us here on the SABC. Annelien van der Poel is the Chief Operating Officer at Debt Rescue South Africa, really weighing in on the impact that after the Reserve Bank's decision to raise the repo rate by 75 basis points to 7% this week. So we'll leave that conversation there. Thank you very much again to her for her time. We're going to take a look at other news now. Making headlines, we've seen that Parliament's Subcommittee on Communications tasked with searching for a new SABC board has recommended the 12 names of their preferred candidates as follows the finalization of the vetting of candidates who were interviewed for positions on the board. The public broadcaster has been without a board for over a month after the expiry of the term of office of the previous board.
The term of office of the previous board ended on the 15th of October. And since then, the public broadcaster has been without an accounting authority. It emerged in Parliament this week that the SABC's CEO had not been duly designated as the accounting authority by the National Treasury in the absence of the board. The subcommittee says it took into consideration continuity, gender and youth representation, as well as the candidates' performance during the marathon interviews. The new board will have 50-50 gender representation if the names are endorsed by the Portfolio Committee and National Assembly. The subcommittee has also chosen 3 names as reserves in case those who have been recommended are unable to serve.
We can agree then that we have dealt with the names. We are also putting the motivation that in the case of challenges, that the consideration would be on the reserve names.
I agree with you.
Once adopted by the committee, the names will be taken to the National Assembly for approval before being recommended to President Cyril Ramaphosa for appointment. Lula Mamatya, SABC News, Parliament.
We continue with more news making headlines this week. President Cyril Ramaphosa has called for more and better trade between South Africa and British companies. The president was on the final day of his 2-day state visit to the United Kingdom, where he held discussions with the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, as well as other business leaders. Now, the president also witnessed the signing of 2 memoranda of understanding in the health sector. For more on this, international relations consultant Dr. Charles Sinkala joins us. A very good afternoon to you, Dr. Charles. Thank you for joining us. Perhaps you could walk us through the significance of the first trip for President Cyril Ramaphosa to the United Kingdom. He's the first head of state to visit the UK under, King Charles. And ultimately, what does it reflect about the new monarchy?
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa, and good afternoon to your viewers. Thank you for having me. Yes, it is quite significant, in terms of the 1961 Vienna Convention, which regulates and permits an opportunity for bilateral and multilateral relationships with nations, and I think it is in line with those agreements that the new king and as well as the new prime minister in the United Kingdom should take up the steps to meet President Ramaphosa as they engage into a new page into their engagement in terms of the relationship between the two countries.
So on the back of that, perhaps how would you weigh in on, the priorities that have emerged, as well as the various stakeholder relations? We have to explore the meaning and what it means, rather, for South Africa and the UK in terms of relations and also the geopolitics at large.
Yes, Lizo, thank you for that question. What we need to understand as African people, specifically South Africa that we are speaking on now, is that the colonial project hasn't ended. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, the longest conference that I've ever seen in the world. It is also known as the Scramble for Africa, but I call it an auction where African territories were auctioned to the highest bidder. And yes, South Africa was sold to the highest bidder, was sold to the British government for $2.8 million. That is in 1884 at that conference. Why this story is because of, if we study the history and we understand that during the discovery of the African resources, there were explorers who had traveled across the continent and they identified territories for prospects of minerals and wealth. These explorers, they formed a pact and they arranged an auction in Berlin in Germany. So they spent a lot of money during that time, and that $2.8 million to this time is in trillion and trillion. So what I'm saying is the British government bought South Africa, and South Africa is registered as an entity, as a company, under the South African business registration, in terms of in the UK. So in terms of going to the United Kingdom and discussing, it is something that they are affirming their sovereignty and power over South Africa, that some of the money that they spent in these territories needs to be paid back. And that's why you see that our continent, and especially South Africa, there is no money, more money which is made in South African government is paid to these colonizers because they spend money and they continue to preside over, if it is the UK, the countries which are colonized by the British, they still are paying for that. And when we talk about the slavery which was abolished, very quickly, Lizo, we need to understand that there was businesses who were in the slave trade who bought those slaves and spent a lot of money, and as well as the victims who were subjected to slavery. So the British government only compensated the business houses, and the victims haven't been compensated. So these are typical questions that we have to discuss.
Yes, so actually, let me pick up on that just quickly in the interest of time. You've spoken about the how the colonial project hasn't ended. And I wonder how this trip was received. I'm only asking that because obviously since the Queen Elizabeth's passing, there has been some controversy that has emerged. We saw there's the issue of the returning, or calls for the returning of the Cullinan diamond, and there are calls for reparations due to colonialism. This particularly came into focus after the Queen Elizabeth's death. How would you weigh in on that, given that it's also about looking at future prospects? What does that then also now look like?
I think, President Ramaphosa alone, we're never going to tackle reparations from the British government. The British government has made it law that they work the way they suit to themselves. Reparations would be a united front for the African leaders to address this issue, and in fact they should subject them to some trade arrangements to pursue or influence the British government to succumb. We see Germany as well, they did the reparation payments, I think in Namibia or Botswana, if I stand to be corrected. But the British have stand fast to continue to subvert the resources of South Africa. But even if they are going there for bilateral talks and tourism, like what Minister Naledi Pandor said, that's the imbalance of businesses and trade. It is not something which is difficult to see. We can see that for a South African to go to the United Kingdom to set up a company or to prospect for other opportunities, it is very difficult as they are subjected for visa restrictions and other documentations that they have to submit. But the Britons, when they come to South Africa, they can register the company immediately, and they are treated as tourists and investors for that matter.
All right, Dr. Charles, I want to thank you very much for your time. Really just weighing in on the significance of, the 2-day state visit to the United Kingdom by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Again, really weighing in on the significance of this and perhaps how this also impacts the geopolitics as this unfolds. So we'll leave that conversation there. Again, Dr. Charles Sinkala is an international relations consultant weighing in on that discussion for us. But for now, though, we're going to leave it there. It's the end of the show as well. Thank you very much for joining us. Of course, we're back again tomorrow for a look at the week ahead. But from myself and the rest of the team, until then, do take care, and it's goodbye for now.